This brief tutorial on the Synclavier³ Midi implementation will also serve as a trip back in time to the days of disco music and opcode MIDI systems. Throughout this documentation, and on many of the Synclavier screens, you will see the three-letter abbreviation OMS. OMS refers to the company Opcode Systems, which implemented the popular Mac OS 9 OMS MIDI framework. While it might be desirable to rework all of the Synclavier screens to use a more modern nomenclature, it is just simply not practical to do so at the current time. If you have been using Synclavier² on Mac OS 10, the Synclavier³ Core MIDI implementation is virtually identical. If, however, you are upgrading from an OS 9 installation, the features of Core MIDI and Synclavier³ are significantly enhanced. One of the very first hurdles in understanding the Synclavier³ MIDI implementation is to work through the confusion generated by the old and conflicting MIDI port names. Synclavier³ implements two kinds of what are called virtual MIDI ports. These virtual MIDI ports can send and receive MIDI data to other applications running on the Macintosh. Synclavier³ creates 16 virtual MIDI ports that are assigned to the Synclavier keyboard, MIDI timecode output, MIDI clock in and out, and all 200 tracks of the Synclavier sequencer. The routing for these virtual ports cannot be changed, and specific MIDI channel numbers must be used to address specific sequencer tracks. An additional set of 64 virtual MIDI ports is created by Synclavier³. These routable virtual MIDI ports can contain MIDI data from more than one sequencer track. The MIDI routing display, otherwise known as the J page in the real-time software, can be used to direct specific tracks to any of the 64 virtual MIDI output ports. This screenshot of the MIDI routing display shows the keyboard being routed to the OMS MIDI output. In this context, the OMS MIDI output is the virtual port named Synclavier² keyboard. Also in this screenshot, track 1 is routed to virtual port 2. The important feature of the virtual ports is that more than one Synclavier sequencer track can be routed to that virtual port. The MIDI routing for the keyboard can also be accomplished from the VK by using the MIDI button. There is a table in the Synclavier³ Core MIDI documentation that lists the specific assignments of which MIDI channel numbers are used for specific sequencer tracks on each of the sequencer track MIDI outputs. The same MIDI channel number would be used to address data to a specific sequencer track if MIDI data was sent into the Synclavier sequencer. The Synclavier³ MIDI clock virtual port can be used to send or receive MIDI song position pointer and MIDI clock data to and from Synclavier³. Additionally, the MIDI timecode virtual MIDI port is able to send MIDI timecode from Synclavier³. At this writing, Synclavier³ is not able to follow external MIDI timecode. Synclavier³ also includes a full-featured window known as the MIDI patching window. This window lets you assign MIDI input and output from real hardware MIDI ports on your Mac, either to or from the keyboard, MIDI timecode, MIDI clock, or all of the sequencer tracks. To recap, the virtual MIDI ports are used to exchange data with other applications running on your Macintosh. The Synclavier MIDI patching window is used to access MIDI data that's being sent from or received by actual hardware MIDI ports on your Mac.